The Lost Library, the wisdom that burned in Alexandria, a gentle journey through time's greatest repository of knowledge. Part 1. The Dream of Alexandria. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through the centuries. We're traveling together tonight, you and I, across more than 2,000 years, to a place where the Mediterranean Sea meets the North African coast. The year is 331 BCE, and a young conqueror stands on a strip of land between the sea and a freshwater lake, dreaming of a city that will outlive empires. Alexander the Great was only 25 years old when he chose this spot. The wind from the sea would have ruffled his hair as he walked the land, accompanied by his architects and advisors. He had conquered Persia, defeated mighty armies, and now he wanted something more than military victory. He wanted to build something eternal. The location Alexander chose was perfect in ways that only a strategic mind could appreciate. A natural harbor, protected by the island of Pharos, fresh water from Lake Mareotis, cool Mediterranean, breezes to temper the Egyptian heat. But Alexander's vision went beyond geography. He imagined a city where Greek culture would merge with Egyptian wisdom, where East would meet West, where knowledge itself would find a home. Alexander never saw his city completed. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE, still a young man of just 32, but his general, Ptolemy, inherited Egypt and made Alexander's dream real. Ptolemy understood something profound. That power built on knowledge lasts longer than power built on swords. The city rose from the desert like a pearl emerging from an oyster. White limestone buildings gleamed in the Sunday-wide streets, were laid out in a grid pattern, a novelty in the ancient world. Canals brought fresh water from the Nile, gardens bloomed in courtyards, and at the heart of it all, Ptolemy planned something unprecedented, a library that would contain all the knowledge in the world. Let yourself imagine walking those ancient streets as the city was being built. The sound of stonecutters' tools, the calls of workers in a dozen languages, the smell of fresh mortar and cedar wood. Alexandria was becoming cosmopolitan before the word existed, drawing people from Greece, Egypt, Judea, Persia, India, and beyond. Ptolemy had learned from the best teachers. He had studied under Aristotle, the great philosopher who believed that knowledge should be collected, organized, and preserved. Aristotle himself had assembled a library, gathering scrolls on every subject imaginable. When Ptolemy looked at what he wanted to create in Alexandria, he thought bigger than Aristotle ever had. He wanted not just a library, but an entire complex dedicated to learning, the Mauseon, the Temple of the Muses. The Muses were the Greek goddesses of the arts and sciences, 9 sisters, each governing a different domain of human creativity and knowledge. Calliope, for epic poetry; Clio, for history; Erato, for love poetry; Euterpe, for music; Melpomene, for tragedy; Polyhymnia, for hymns; Terpsichore, for dance; Thalia, for comedy; and Urania, for astronomy. By dedicating his institution to all 9 muses, Ptolemy was making a statement. All knowledge is sacred. All learning is worthy of divine protection. Construction of the Mauseon complex began around 300 BCE, during the reign of Ptolemy I Soter, whose epithet meant savior. His son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who ruled from 283 to 246 BCE, would expand the vision even further, making the library not just a repository but an active center of scholarship. The building itself was magnificent. Though no contemporary descriptions of its exact architecture survive, ancient sources tell us it was part of the royal palace complex. There were lecture halls where scholars could teach, gardens where philosophers could walk and debate, Dining halls where learned men could share meals and ideas, observatories for studying the stars, rooms for dissection where physicians could study human anatomy, and everywhere, in room after room, scrolls. The scrolls were kept in specially designed shelves and storage rooms. They were made of papyrus, the paper-like material created from reeds that grew along the Nile. Each scroll was carefully labeled with tags indicating its contents. Some sources claim the library eventually held 400,000 scrolls. Others say 700,000. A few enthusiastic ancient writers claimed numbers even higher. The truth is, we'll never know exactly, but even the conservative estimates suggest a collection larger than anything the world had ever seen. Part 2. Gathering the world's knowledge. Let your mind settle now into the story of how the library grew, how it became the wonder that it was. The Ptolemies didn't wait for knowledge to come to them. They went out and seized it, sometimes quite literally. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the king who oversaw the library's greatest expansion, issued a decree that would shape the ancient world's relationship with books. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor was searched. Not for weapons or contraband in the usual sense, but for books. Any scrolls found on board were confiscated and taken to the library where scribes would copy them. The originals were kept for the library's collection, and the copies, often hastily made and of inferior quality, were returned to the ship's owners along with some monetary compensation. Imagine being a merchant whose ship has just arrived in Alexandria after weeks at sea. You're carrying a precious scroll, perhaps a rare text of Homer's poetry that's been in your family for generations, carefully preserved and passed down. The harbor officials board your vessel. They find your scroll. Despite your protests, it's carried away. Days later, you receive a newer copy on cheaper papyrus, along with a small bag of coins. Your family heirloom now belongs to Egypt. This practice, which might seem like theft to modern sensibilities, was seen by the Ptolemies as a duty. They believed they were preserving civilization itself, and in a way, they were right. Many texts survived only because of copies made in Alexandria. But the library's acquisitions weren't limited to this maritime piracy. The Ptolemies actively recruited scholars from across the known world, offering them generous stipends, tax exemptions, free room and board, and most precious of all, access to the greatest collection of knowledge ever assembled. These scholars became the guardians and curators of the collection, and they in turn attracted students, creating a perpetual cycle of learning. The library sent agents across the Mediterranean and beyond, traveling to Athens, Rhodes, Pergamum, and Antioch with bags of gold authorized to purchase any book they could find. They bought private libraries from wealthy collectors. They commissioned translations of foreign texts. They paid scholars to write new works that would then be added to the collection. One of the most ambitious projects was the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. According to legend, Ptolemy II Philadelphus brought 72 Jewish scholars from Jerusalem to Alexandria and housed them on the island of Pharos. Working independently, each scholar translated the Hebrew scriptures. When they compared their work, all 72 translations were supposedly identical, a divine confirmation of the accuracy of what became known as the Septuagint. Whether or not the legend is true, and most scholars doubt the miraculous elements, the Septuagint was indeed created in Alexandria, making the Hebrew scriptures accessible to the Greek-speaking world for the first time. This single act of translation would have profound effects on the development of Christianity centuries later. The library also commissioned a translation of the ancient Zoroastrian texts from Persia. Egyptian priests were invited to translate their temple records and sacred writings into Greek. Scholars traveled to India and returned with texts on mathematics and philosophy. The library became a place where the wisdom of the entire world converged. But acquiring books was only the beginning. The library needed organization, and here the Greek genius for categorization came into play. A scholar named Callimachus of Cyrene, who worked at the library in the mid-3rd century BCE, created the Pinakes, or tablets. This was nothing less than the world's first library catalog, a systematic bibliography of Greek literature. The Pinakes ran to 120 volumes. It divided all knowledge into categories: poetry, drama, history, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and more. Within each category, works were listed alphabetically by author. Each entry included the author's biography, a summary of the work, and sometimes even critical commentary on the text's authenticity. Let yourself feel the weight of that achievement. Before Callimachus, finding a specific text in a large collection was nearly impossible. After his catalog, scholars could locate exactly what they needed. The Pinakes didn't just organize the library, it organized human knowledge itself, creating categories and connections that would influence how we think about information for millennia to come. Part 3. The Scholars and Their Discoveries. As you relax deeper into this story, let me tell you about the people who walked the library's halls, who unrolled its precious scrolls, who made discoveries that changed the world. Eratosthenes of Cyrene arrived in Alexandria around 245 BCE. A poet, mathematician, and geographer, he became the 3rd head librarian of the Great Library. But his most famous achievement came from a simple observation and brilliant reasoning. Eratosthenes had read that in Syene, a city far south of Alexandria on the Nile, the sun stood directly overhead at noon on the summer solstice. In Syene, vertical sticks cast no shadow, and sunlight shone straight down to the bottom of wells. But Eratosthenes knew that in Alexandria, at that same moment, vertical objects did cast shadows. Using geometry and the measured distance between the two cities, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth. His figure was remarkably accurate, within about 2% of the actual value. More than 1,700 years before Columbus, a librarian in Alexandria proved the Earth was round and calculated its size, using nothing but books, observation, and mathematics. Picture Eratosthenes standing in Alexandria's bright sunlight, measuring the angle of a shadow. He's holding a simple gnomon, a vertical stick used as a sundial. The shadow it casts is about 7 degrees from vertical. He knows from his reading that in Syene, at this exact moment, there is no shadow. The difference in shadow angle, combined with the distance between cities, gives him the Earth's curvature. He calculates, checks his figures, calculates again, and there it is. The Earth measures about 250,000 stades in circumference. The ancient world has been measured. Euclid, though he probably arrived in Alexandria before the library was fully established, taught in the Mausian and used its resources to write his masterwork, The Elements. This 13-volume treatise on geometry and mathematics would become one of the most influential textbooks ever written, used continuously for more than 2,000 years. The Elements presented geometry as a logical system built from simple axioms. Starting with basic definitions, a point is that which has no part. A line is breadthless length. Euclid constructed an entire mathematical universe through pure reason. The theorem named after Pythagoras, about right triangles, the principles of proportion, the properties of circles and spheres, all presented with crystalline, logical clarity. Students in ancient Alexandria would have studied from copies of The Elements kept in the library, laboriously copying out the geometric diagrams and mathematical proofs. Those same proofs are still studied today, connecting modern students to the minds of ancient Alexandria across the millennia. Archimedes of Syracuse didn't live in Alexandria, but he studied there as a young man. The library's collection of mathematical texts shaped his thinking, and he maintained correspondence with Alexandrian scholars throughout his life. when he made his discoveries about the principles of the lever, when he worked out the mathematics of floating bodies, when he approximated the value of pi, he was building on knowledge preserved in Alexandria. Hero of Alexandria, sometimes called Heron, worked at the Mausoleum in the 1st century CE. He was an engineer and mathematician who wrote extensively about machines. He invented the first vending machine, a device that dispensed holy water when you inserted a coin. He created an early steam engine, the Eolipoli, which spun when heated water created jets of steam. He wrote about automata, mechanical devices that could move on their own. Hero's writings reveal something wonderful about the library. It wasn't just a place to read old books, but a workshop where knowledge led to invention. The library had equipment for experiments. Scholars could test theories, build models, and push the boundaries of what was possible. In the field of medicine, the library enabled breakthroughs that wouldn't be matched for more than 1,000 years. Herophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Chios, both working in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, conducted systematic studies of human anatomy through dissection, a practice forbidden in most of the ancient world. They distinguished between arteries and veins. They traced the nervous system and understood that nerves transmitted sensations and commands. Herophilus described the eye's retina, identified the ovaries and fallopian tubes, and measured the pulse using a water clock. Erasistratus came remarkably close to understanding the circulatory system, describing the heart as a pump. How did they make such discoveries? The library gave them access to all previous medical knowledge. They could read Egyptian texts on surgery, Greek treatises on anatomy, and Persian wisdom on healing herbs. Standing on the shoulders of centuries of accumulated knowledge, they could see further than anyone had before. Part 4. The place where cultures met. Let yourself drift now into the cosmopolitan world that the library created. Alexandria wasn't just a Greek city in Egypt. It became a true meeting place of civilizations, and the library stood at the center of this cultural exchange. Jewish scholars worked alongside Egyptian priests. Greek philosophers debated with Persian magi. Indian mathematicians shared their discoveries with Babylonian astronomers. The library's reading rooms would have echoed with conversations in a dozen languages as translators worked to make knowledge accessible across linguistic boundaries. The Septuagint translation project brought Jewish learning into the Greek intellectual world, but the exchange went both ways. Jewish scholars in Alexandria, most notably Philo-Judaeus in the 1st century CE, began to interpret their religious traditions through the lens of Greek philosophy. Philo read Moses as a philosopher, finding in the Torah concepts compatible with Platonic thought. This synthesis of Jewish theology and Greek philosophy would later profoundly influence early Christian thinkers. Egyptian knowledge, accumulated over 3 millennia, found new life in Alexandria. The ancient wisdom of the priests, their mathematics and astronomy developed for tracking the Nile's floods and creating an accurate calendar. Their medical knowledge gained from mummification practices, their architectural principles demonstrated in the pyramids, all of this was translated into Greek and made available to scholars who might never have encountered it otherwise. The library preserved and transmitted the Corpus Hermeticum, texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a syncretic combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. These writings blended Egyptian mysticism with Greek philosophy, creating a tradition of Hermetic wisdom that would influence European thought during the Renaissance. Think of a reading room in the library at midday. Sunlight streams through high windows. The air smells of papyrus and ink. At one table, a Greek scholar unrolls a scroll containing Plato's Republic, his lips moving silently as he reads. At another, an Egyptian priest examines a translation of the Book of the Dead, checking the Greek rendering against his memory of the original hieroglyphs. In the corner, a young mathematician from Bactria studies a text on number theory, preparing to write a commentary that will add new insights. They all look up when a commotion announces a new arrival. a traveler from India carrying scrolls wrapped in silk. The head librarian greets him warmly. The scrolls are carefully unwrapped. They contain Sanskrit texts on astronomy and mathematics, including concepts of zero and positional notation that will revolutionize Greek mathematics. Scribes are immediately summoned to begin creating copies. The traveler is offered accommodation and an invitation to lecture on the contents of his precious texts. This scene, imagined but based on what we know of the library's practices, captures its essence. It was a place where knowledge flowed freely, where barriers of language and culture were overcome in the pursuit of understanding. The library's collection included star catalogs from Babylon, where astronomers had tracked the heavens for centuries. Greek scholars could now compare their observations with Babylonian records going back hundreds of years, enabling them to detect long-term patterns in celestial movements. This led to more accurate predictions of eclipses and a deeper understanding of planetary motion. Maps and geographical texts from across the world were collected and compared. Merchants' reports of distant lands, travelers' accounts of strange peoples and customs, navigational charts from Phoenician sailors, all were gathered and synthesized. The library made possible a comprehensive geography of the known world. Part 5. The Art of Memory. As you settle deeper into rest, consider what it meant to preserve knowledge in the ancient world. We live in an age of digital storage, where information seems immortal, endlessly copied and backed up. But in Alexandria, every text was precious. Every copy, a labor of weeks or months. The library employed hundreds of scribes, skilled workers who spent their days copying scrolls. It was painstaking work. The scribe would unroll a portion of the original text, read a section, then carefully reproduce it on fresh papyrus. Every letter had to be formed perfectly. There was no spell check, no easy way to correct errors. A single sneeze at the wrong moment could ruin hours of work. The best scribes developed remarkable accuracy. They could copy an entire scroll with only a handful of minor errors, but even small mistakes could accumulate as texts were copied and recopied over generations. This is why the library's practice of keeping original texts whenever possible was so important. They served as authoritative sources against which copies could be checked. Imagine the quiet concentration of the copying room. Rows of scribes bent over their work, the scratch of reed pens on papyrus, the occasional whispered question when a word in the original is unclear. Light from oil lamps and high windows illuminating the careful work of preserving civilization. Some scrolls received special treatment. Important texts were copied on the finest papyrus, with careful attention to spacing and letter formation. These deluxe editions were beautiful objects in themselves, with ornate title tags and protective cases. Other texts, deemed less important or needed quickly, might be copied more roughly, with abbreviations and compressed writing to save material. The library developed a sophisticated system for verifying texts. When multiple copies of the same work existed, scholars would compare them, noting variations. This textual criticism, the systematic study of how texts change through copying, was pioneered in Alexandria. Scholars learned to recognize copyist errors, to spot later additions to original texts, and to attempt to reconstruct what an author originally wrote. This work preserved not just the words of ancient authors, but their exact thoughts. When we read Homer today, or Plato, or Euripid, we're reading texts that were carefully maintained through this Alexandrian tradition of textual scholarship. The library also innovated in how scrolls were stored. Early libraries simply stacked scrolls on shelves, making specific texts difficult to find. Alexandria developed a system of labeled compartments and an organizational scheme that grouped related works together. A scholar looking for astronomical texts would be directed to a specific section where scrolls were arranged systematically. Climate control was crucial. Egypt's dry climate helped preserve papyrus, but the library took additional precautions. Scrolls were kept in rooms designed to maintain stable temperature and humidity. They were regularly inspected for damage from insects or deterioration. Badly damaged scrolls were recopied before the text became illegible. Picture the librarians making their rounds, carefully unrolling portions of scrolls to check their condition. They note which texts need recopying soon. They record which scrolls have been consulted recently and which sit unused. They're not just maintaining a collection, they're keeping alive the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Part 6. The questions we ask the stars. Let your thoughts drift upward now, toward the night sky above ancient Alexandria. The library's scholars looked at those same stars and asked profound questions about the universe and our place in it. Aristarchus of Samos worked in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE. Using the library's astronomical records and his own observations, he developed a revolutionary theory. The Earth revolves around the Sun, not the other way around. He proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis, explaining the apparent movement of the stars. He suggested that the stars are actually distant suns and that the universe is far larger than anyone had imagined. This heliocentric model wouldn't be widely accepted for nearly 2,000 years when Copernicus proposed it again in the 16th century. But Aristarchus had worked it out first in Alexandria, using mathematics and careful observation. His writings were preserved in the library, where they waded through the centuries for minds ready to accept their implications. Hipparchus of Nicaea, working in the 2nd century BCE, made observations so precise that they revealed something remarkable. The stars weren't fixed after all. Over long periods, their positions shifted slightly. He had discovered the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in Earth's axis that takes about 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. To make this discovery, Hipparchus compared his own observations with Babylonian records preserved in the library, some of which were hundreds of years old. He created a star catalog listing over 850 stars with their positions. He developed the system of stellar magnitude still used today to classify star brightness. And he did all this without a telescope, using only careful observation and mathematical reasoning, supported by the library's accumulated astronomical knowledge. The library housed instruments for celestial observation, water clocks for precise timekeeping, armillary spheres, mechanical models of the heavens that showed how celestial bodies moved, astrolabes for measuring the positions of stars. Scholars could test their theories by comparing predictions with actual observations. Claudius Ptolemy, working in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE, synthesized all previous astronomical knowledge into his massive work, the Almagest. Although his Earth-centered model of the universe was ultimately wrong, the mathematical techniques he developed were brilliant. His system of epicycles, circles within circles, could predict planetary positions with remarkable accuracy. The Almagest remained the standard astronomical text in both Islamic and Christian civilizations for 14 centuries. Think of Ptolemy in the library, scrolls spread before him. He's reading Hipparchus on precession, Aristarchus on planetary sizes, Babylonian records of lunar eclipses. He's synthesizing centuries of observation and theory into a comprehensive system. He calculates and recalculates, adjusting his model to fit the data. The result is a masterwork that demonstrates both the power and the limitations of the Alexandrian method. Brilliant mathematical reasoning, working from incomplete understanding of the physical world. But astronomy wasn't pursued just for abstract knowledge. It had practical applications that mattered to everyday life. Accurate calendars depended on understanding celestial motions. Navigation at sea required knowledge of the stars. Agricultural planning needed reliable predictions of seasons. The library's astronomical work served all these purposes. The scholars also studied the moon's effect on tides, documented comets and meteors, and attempted to understand eclipses. They knew eclipses weren't divine portents, but natural phenomena that could be predicted. The library made astronomical knowledge available to any educated person, stripping away superstition and replacing it with understanding. Part 7. The Healing Arts. As you relax even deeper, let me tell you about how the library changed the practice of medicine, transforming healing from an art based on tradition and superstition into a science grounded in observation and reason. Before Alexandria, medical knowledge was fragmented and local. Egyptian physicians had their techniques, learned from mummification and temple traditions. Greek doctors followed the teachings of Hippocrates, emphasizing observation of symptoms and natural healing. Persian and Indian medicine had their own rich traditions. The library brought all these approaches together. The medical texts preserved in Alexandria included the Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of Greek medical writings covering everything from surgery to medical ethics. The famous Hippocratic Oath, which still influences medical practice today, was preserved and taught in Alexandria. But Alexandrian physicians didn't just preserve old knowledge, they advanced it dramatically. Part 7. The Healing Arts. As you relax even deeper, let me tell you about how the library changed the practice of medicine, transforming healing from an art based on tradition and superstition into a science grounded in observation and reason. Before Alexandria, medical knowledge was fragmented and local. Egyptian physicians had their techniques, learned from mummification and temple traditions. Greek doctors followed the teachings of Hippocrates, emphasizing observation of symptoms and natural healing. Persian and Indian medicine had their own rich traditions. The library brought all these approaches together. The medical texts preserved in Alexandria included the Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of Greek medical writings covering everything from surgery to medical ethics. The famous Hippocratic Oath, which still influences medical practice today, was preserved and taught in Alexandria. But Alexandrian physicians didn't just preserve old knowledge, they advanced it dramatically. Part 7. The Healing Arts. As you relax even deeper, let me tell you about how the library changed the practice of medicine, transforming healing from an art based on tradition and superstition into a science grounded in observation and reason. Before Alexandria, medical knowledge was fragmented and local. Egyptian physicians had their techniques, learned from mummification and temple traditions. Greek doctors followed the teachings of Hippocrates, emphasizing observation of symptoms and natural healing. Persian and Indian medicine had their own rich traditions. The library brought all these approaches together. The medical texts preserved in Alexandria included the Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of Greek medical writings covering everything from surgery to medical ethics. The famous Hippocratic Oath, which still influences medical practice today, was preserved and taught in Alexandria. But Alexandrian physicians didn't just preserve old knowledge, they advanced it dramatically. The practice of human dissection, which had been taboo in most ancient cultures, was permitted in Alexandria under the early Ptolemies. This gave physicians unprecedented insight into human anatomy. Herophilus and Erasistratus, whom I mentioned earlier, wrote detailed anatomical treatises based on their dissections. Herophilus described the structure of the brain, identifying the cerebrum and cerebellum. He understood that the brain, not the heart, was the center of the nervous system and intelligence. He studied the eye in detail, naming the retina. His descriptions of blood vessels were so accurate that some still bear his name. The tor hierophili is a venous structure in the brain. Close your eyes and imagine Herophilus in the anatomy theater, carefully dissecting a cadaver while students watch and take notes. He points out the path of nerves from the brain to the limbs. He demonstrates how tendons connect muscles to bones. He shows the structure of the liver, the stomach, the intestines. Every observation challenges old assumptions and adds to genuine understanding. Erasistratus made equally important discoveries. He distinguished between sensory and motor nerves. He described the heart's valves and understood that they prevented blood from flowing backward. He came tantalizingly close to discovering the circulation of blood, though he didn't quite complete the picture that would wait for William Harvey in the 17th century. The library's medical section contained texts on pharmacology from across the known world. Egyptian papyri described hundreds of medicinal plants. Greek texts explained the theory of the four humors. Indian and Chinese medical knowledge brought different perspectives on health and disease. Alexandrian physicians could compare treatments and select the most effective. Dioscorides, a Greek physician who worked in the 1st century CE, created De Materia Medica, a pharmacological encyclopedia describing over 600 plants and their medicinal uses. This work, compiled using the library's resources, remained the standard reference on medicinal plants for 15 centuries. Dioscorides didn't just list plants. He described their properties, explained how to prepare them, and specified their uses. Picture a physician in Alexandria's medical school teaching students about medicinal herbs. He holds up a plant specimen, then unrolls a scroll containing Dioscorides' description. The students learn to identify the plant, prepare it properly, and understand which conditions it treats. They're learning from accumulated experience across multiple cultures, preserved in the library. The library also preserved surgical texts. Ancient Egyptian papyri described surgical procedures for wounds, fractures, and tumors. Greek texts discussed instruments and techniques. Alexandrian physicians developed new surgical tools and refined procedures. They understood the importance of cleanliness. Though they didn't know about germs, they simply observed that clean wounds healed better. Medical ethics was also a subject of study. The Hippocratic tradition emphasized the physician's duty to the patient. First, do no harm became a guiding principle. Physicians debated when surgery was appropriate, how to tell patients difficult truths, and what obligations doctors had to treat the poor as well as the rich. Part 8, Words and Their Power. Let your mind settle now on the library's greatest treasure, literature. All the scientific knowledge, all the mathematical theorems, all the medical discoveries, important as they were, the library's heart was the preservation of human stories and wisdom. The works of Homer, the Iliad and Odyssey, existed in dozens of different versions before Alexandria. Each region had its own tradition, with variations in wording and even in plot details. The Alexandrian scholars, led by Zenodotus and later Aristarchus of Samothrace, collected every version they could find and compared them. They developed methods of textual criticism still used today. When manuscripts disagreed, they tried to determine which reading was original. They marked lines they suspected were later additions. They wrote commentaries explaining difficult passages. The result was a standardized text of Homer that became the basis for all later copies. Imagine the reading room dedicated to Homer. Dozens of scrolls contain different versions of the same passages. Scholars unroll them side by side, comparing word by word. They debate. Is this phrase original to Homer, or did a later performer add it? Does this dialect form suggest an early or late composition? Their careful work rescues Homer from the chaos of oral tradition and fixes the poems in a reliable written form. The library preserved all of Greek drama. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes and Menander. These plays were living cultural treasures, still performed in Alexandria's theaters, but they were also texts to be studied, analyzed, and preserved. Scholars wrote commentaries on the plays, explaining mythological references, clarifying archaic words, and analyzing the poet's techniques. They debated interpretations. They traced how later playwrights borrowed from earlier ones. Literary criticism was born in Alexandria's reading rooms. The library also collected poetry from across the Greek world, the lyrics of Sappho and Alcaeus, the choral odes of Pindar, the elegies and epigrams of countless poets. Much of this poetry survives today only in fragments, but what does survive came through Alexandria. Think of a scholar discovering a rare scroll of Sappho's poetry brought by a merchant from Lesbos. The poems speak of love and desire with stunning directness. The scholar immediately orders copies made. He writes a commentary placing the poems in their historical context. Thanks to his work, Sappho's voice reaches across the centuries, though most of her poems would eventually be lost when the library disappeared. Alexandrian poets like Callimachus, Apollonius of Rhodes, and Theocritus created a new style of poetry, learned and elusive, playing with the entire literary tradition preserved in the library. Callimachus wrote miniature epics and scholarly poems that required extensive knowledge to fully appreciate. Apollonius wrote the Argonautica, a sophisticated retelling of Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece. Theocritus invented pastoral poetry, idealized songs of shepherds and rural life. These poets wrote for an audience of scholars, people who had read everything in the library and would catch every subtle reference. Their work demonstrates how the library changed literature itself, creating a new kind of highly educated, self-conscious writing. The library preserved philosophy as well. The dialogues of Plato, preserved complete. The lecture notes of Aristotle, collected and organized. The fragments of pre-Socratic philosophers like Heraclitus and Parmenides. The teachings of Epicurus and Zeno the Stoic. All human wisdom about how to live, what is real, what can be known, what is good. Scholars in Alexandria studied these philosophical texts, wrote commentaries, and developed new schools of thought. Neoplatonism, the philosophy developed by Plotinus and his followers in 3rd century Alexandria, synthesized Plato's thought with elements from Aristotle, the Stoics, and even Eastern mysticism. This philosophy would profoundly influence Christian theology and remain influential through the Renaissance. Part 9. The Slow Decline. Let yourself breathe slowly as we come to the sadder part of our story. All great things fade, and the library's decline was gradual, a slow dimming of light rather than a sudden darkness. The library reached its peak in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, but even then, challenges arose. In 145 BCE, Ptolemy VIII Physcon expelled many scholars from Alexandria during political turmoil. Intellectuals fled to other cities, taking knowledge with them. The library survived, but its monopoly on learning had been broken. Pergamum, a rival city in Asia Minor, built its own great library. So did other centers of learning around the Mediterranean. This competition was actually healthy for knowledge. Ideas spread more widely. But it meant Alexandria was no longer the unique repository it had once been. Roman conquest brought new challenges. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, pursuing his rival Pompey in Rome's civil war, he became entangled in Egyptian politics. Caesar supported Cleopatra's claim to the throne, leading to fighting in Alexandria's streets and harbor. During the fighting, fire broke out. Ancient sources disagree on what happened next. Some say the great library burned. Others say only warehouses near the harbor, containing books waiting to be shipped, were destroyed. The main library complex, attached to the palace, may have escaped major damage. Let the uncertainty of this moment settle over you. We don't know for certain what burned that day. 40,000 scrolls lost, some sources say, or perhaps just some duplicate copies, others suggest. The truth is lost to time, like so much else. But the library continued. Later, Roman emperors, especially Augustus and Claudius, supported it. Mark Antony supposedly gave Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls from the Pergamum library as a gift, perhaps to replace books lost in Caesar's fire. In the 3rd century CE, a new disaster struck. Emperor Caracalla, angry with Alexandria for mocking him, ordered a massacre of the city's young men and scholars. The Mausoleum was shut down, its scholars scattered or killed. This blow damaged the library's community of learning far more than any fire damaged its collection. The library limped on, a shadow of its former self. The rise of Christianity brought new tensions. Christian emperors viewed pagan learning with suspicion. The library, dedicated to the Muses, full of heathen philosophy and science, represented an old order passing away. In 391 CE, the Serapeum, a daughter library of the Great Mausian, was destroyed when Christian mobs attacked pagan temples in Alexandria. The Roman Emperor Theodosius I had ordered the closure of pagan temples throughout the empire. A crowd, inflamed by the Bishop Theophilus, stormed the Serapeum. What books remained there were burned or scattered. Picture the scene with sorrow but from a distance, smoke rising from the beautiful temple, scrolls thrown from windows, trampled in the street, works of philosophy and science, astronomy and medicine, poetry and history reduced to ash and fragments. The mob believes it's doing God's work, destroying evil. But knowledge has no theology. It belongs to everyone, and its loss impoverishes all. A few scrolls might have been saved by sympathetic individuals. Some may have been carried away to private libraries or other institutions. But the Serapeum's destruction marked the effective end of the great library tradition in Alexandria. In 415 CE, the philosopher and mathematician Hypatia was murdered by a Christian mob in Alexandria. Hypatia was one of the last great scholars in the Alexandrian tradition. She taught mathematics and philosophy, wrote commentaries on classical works, and maintained the old ideal of reason and learning. Her death symbolized the end of an era. Imagine Hypatia in her final days, teaching students in a world growing hostile to her kind of knowledge. She explains Ptolemy's astronomy, Apollonius's geometry. She discusses Plato's philosophy. Her students listen intently, aware that such teaching is becoming dangerous. When the mob comes for her, it's not just a woman they're killing, but a tradition of learning stretching back 700 years. Part 10. What was lost? As you sink deeper towards sleep, let me tell you about what we lost when the library fell. The catalog alone, Callimachus's Pinakes, ran to 120 volumes. It's gone completely. We have only fragments quoted by later writers. Of the estimated 700,000 scrolls the library may have held at its peak, perhaps 99% are completely lost. We know many works only by their titles, mentioned in lists or referenced in surviving texts. Imagine the knowledge contained in those lost works. The complete works of Sappho, 9 books of poetry, of which we have perhaps one complete poem, and fragments of others. She was considered one of the greatest poets of antiquity. What insights into life and love, what beauty of expression, what human truth is lost in those missing poems. The lost plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Of about 330 tragedies written by these three masters, only 33 survive complete. Each lost play was a window into ancient Greek thought and feeling. Characters we'll never meet, stories we'll never hear, poetry that will never move us again. The histories we've lost. Hundreds of historical works describing events, peoples, and places are gone. We know them only by title. What details of daily life, what political insights, what human stories vanished with them. The scientific works. Treatises on astronomy by scholars who calculated the movements of planets. Medical texts describing surgical techniques and treatments. Mathematical proofs we've had to rediscover independently. Engineering manuals showing how to build marvels we can barely imagine. Let yourself feel the weight of this loss, but gently, from a distance. The library contained copies of many works that existed nowhere else. When Alexandria's books burned or rotted or were thrown away, entire genres of literature vanished. We'll never know what we don't know. But some knowledge did survive. Some scrolls were copied and spread to other libraries before the end came. The works that did survive shaped all subsequent Western civilization. The texts of Plato and Aristotle, preserved through Alexandria's copying. The plays of Sophocles and Euripides, Euclid's Elements, Ptolemy's Almagest. These traveled from Alexandria to the medieval Islamic world, where they were translated into Arabic and studied. When Christian Europe rediscovered these works in the Middle Ages, translated back into Latin from Arabic, it sparked the Renaissance. The preserved fragments of Alexandria's knowledge helped rebuild European civilization after the Dark Ages. Think of it like this. The library was a seed bank of human knowledge. Most seeds were lost, but enough survived, carried away by winds of conquest and commerce, to replant gardens of learning in new times and places. Part 11. The Echoes Through Time. Rest easy now as we trace the library's influence through the centuries that followed. Though the physical library was gone, its spirit lived on. In the Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th to the 13th centuries, Muslim scholars created their own great libraries. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad deliberately modeled itself on Alexandria. Caliph al-Ma'mun sent agents across the world to gather manuscripts, just as the Ptolemies had done. Texts were translated from Greek and Syriac into Arabic. The knowledge preserved in Alexandria flowered anew. Arab scholars studied Euclid and Ptolemy, Hippocrates and Galen. They built on this foundation, advancing mathematics with algebra and algorithms, pushing astronomy to new precision, developing sophisticated medical techniques. The Alexandrian tradition of scholarship collecting knowledge, comparing sources, testing theories continued in Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and other centers of Islamic learning. When European scholars, emerging from the Middle Ages, sought ancient knowledge, they found it in Arabic translations. The works that had passed from Alexandria to the Islamic world now returned to Christian Europe, sparking the 12th century Renaissance and eventually the larger Renaissance of the 14th through 17th centuries. Universities founded in medieval Europe, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge looked back to Alexandria as a model. The idea of a community of scholars supported to pursue knowledge for its own sake, living and working together in dedicated facilities with large libraries. This was the Alexandrian model reborn. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century created a revolution that the Ptolemies would have envied. Suddenly, knowledge could be copied quickly and distributed widely. Books became affordable. Libraries could grow beyond anything ancient Alexandria achieved, but the goal remained the same: to gather, preserve, and share human knowledge. In the Renaissance, scholars explicitly tried to recreate what had been lost. The Medici Library in Florence, the Vatican Library in Rome, the Royal Library of France, all sought to collect all knowledge, just as Alexandria had. They couldn't recover what had been lost, but they could prevent future losses by creating multiple copies of every important text. Let your mind drift across these centuries. Books copied by hand in medieval monasteries, scholars in Baghdad debating Aristotle in Arabic, translators in Toledo rendering Arabic texts into Latin, printers in Venice producing classical texts by the hundreds. Each is a continuation of Alexandria's work. Part 12. The Library in Modern Imagination. As you near sleep, consider how the lost library haunts our imagination still. It appears in novels and films, in poems and songs. It has become a symbol of lost wisdom, of knowledge destroyed by ignorance, of the fragility of civilization. Writers have imagined the library in its glory. Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine author who was himself a librarian, wrote The Library of Babel, imagining an infinite library containing all possible books. His vision was inspired by Alexandria, the idea that somewhere a library might contain all knowledge, even knowledge not yet discovered. Umberto Eco's novel The Name of the Rose centers on a medieval monastery library that guards dangerous knowledge, echoing fears about what the Alexandrian library might have contained. What forbidden wisdom might have been lost? What secrets might never be rediscovered? In 2002, Egypt opened the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a new library in Alexandria built near the site of the ancient one. Its architecture is deliberately symbolic. A massive, cylindrical building with a slanted roof like a rising sun, covered in letters from every human alphabet. The reading room can hold 2,000 readers. The shelves can hold 8 million books. The new library is both a memorial to what was lost and a statement of hope. Knowledge can be destroyed, but the human drive to learn, to gather wisdom, to share understanding that cannot be burned. Every library in the world, from the vast to the tiny, carries forward the Alexandrian dream. Think of your local library, humble as it might be. Shelves of books waiting to be read, computers offering access to digital knowledge, librarians helping people find information. It's a descendant of Alexandria, part of an unbroken tradition reaching back more than 2,000 years. Modern technology has created new ways to preserve knowledge. Digital archives can hold millions of texts. The internet makes information instantly accessible worldwide. We can preserve knowledge in ways the ancient Alexandrians never imagined. Yet, we face our own version of Alexandria's vulnerability. Digital storage degrades, websites disappear, file formats become obsolete. We've lost early internet content as surely as we lost ancient scrolls. The work of preservation is never finished. Each generation must choose to value and protect knowledge, or watch it slip away. Part 13. The Lesson of Alexandria. Let yourself drift into the deepest peace as we consider what Alexandria teaches us across the millennia. The library's greatest lesson is about the value of knowledge itself. The Ptolemies spent fortunes building and maintaining their library fortunes that could have bought armies or built monuments. They chose to invest in knowledge because they understood something profound. Wisdom is the foundation of civilization. Everything we take for granted in modern life rests on accumulated knowledge. The medicine that heals us, the technology that connects us, the agriculture that feeds us, the engineering that shelters us, all built on centuries of learning, preserved and transmitted from one generation to the next. When knowledge is lost, it must be painfully rediscovered. After the library's fall, Europe lost advanced medical knowledge. Techniques of surgery that Alexandrian physicians practiced routinely weren't rediscovered for 1,000 years. Mathematical concepts had to be reinvented. Astronomical knowledge had to be reobserved. The library also teaches us about the danger of fragility. Knowledge concentrated in a single place is vulnerable. This is why the Alexandrian model spread, why multiple libraries, multiple copies, multiple centers of learning are crucial. Redundancy in preservation is not wasteful, it's essential. We see this principle in action today. Major libraries cooperate to digitize rare texts, ensuring that if one copy is destroyed, others survive. Universities share research openly. The internet distributes information so widely that no single disaster can erase it completely. But the library's story also warns us about the danger of ideological destruction. Books weren't just accidentally burned. At various times, they were deliberately destroyed by people who saw knowledge as dangerous, who feared what people might learn, who wanted to control what could be known. This impulse persists. Throughout history and even today, books are banned, burned, censored, knowledge is suppressed, The reasons change: religious orthodoxy, political control, moral panic, but the effect is the same: darkness where there could be light. Every time a library is destroyed, whether in ancient Alexandria, in Timbuktu in 2013, or anywhere else, humanity loses something irreplaceable. We become smaller, poorer, more ignorant. The thread connecting us to our past frays. Yet the story of Alexandria is ultimately hopeful. Despite all that was lost, despite centuries of destruction and neglect, enough survived to rebuild. Knowledge is resilient. As long as some people value learning, as long as some institutions preserve and share wisdom, the light continues. Part 14, The Keepers of Memory. In these final moments before sleep, think about the people who kept knowledge alive after Alexandria fell. The monks copying manuscripts in medieval monasteries, spending months or years to reproduce a single book. The Islamic scholars translating Greek texts into Arabic, ensuring wisdom crossed linguistic boundaries. The Jewish scholars maintaining their textual traditions through persecution and diaspora. Picture a monk in Ireland in the 7th century, bent over a manuscript in candlelight. His fingers are cramped from hours of writing. His eyes strain to see the fading text he's copying. But he continues because he knows this might be the only copy of this text in the world. If he doesn't copy it, it might be lost forever. He's a keeper of memory, a guardian of knowledge, a spiritual descendant of the Alexandrian librarians. In Toledo in the 12th century, scholars gather around a table. A Jewish scholar reads from a Hebrew text. A Muslim scholar translates it into Arabic. A Christian scholar writes down the Latin translation. 3 faiths, 3 languages, 1 purpose: to preserve and transmit knowledge. They're continuing Alexandria's work. In Florence during the Renaissance, Cosimo de' Medici funds the search for ancient manuscripts. His agents travel to remote monasteries, offering gold for moldy scrolls. They find texts that haven't been read in centuries. Copyists and translators go to work. Knowledge lost since Alexandria begins to resurface. The keepers of memory are winning today. Librarians and archivists, curators and digitizers, teachers and scholars continue this ancient work. They preserve the old and make room for the new. They organize knowledge so it can be found. They protect it from destruction, whether by fire, flood, censorship, or simple neglect. You might be one of these keepers yourself. If you've ever shared what you know with someone else, if you've ever preserved a family story or saved an important document, if you've ever taught or learned or simply wondered about the world, you're part of this tradition. Conclusion: the dream continues. As you slip into sleep, carry with you this thought. The Library of Alexandria is not entirely lost. It lives on in every library that exists today. It lives on in the principle that knowledge should be gathered, preserved, and shared. It lives on in every person who values learning. The physical building is gone. The papyrus scrolls have crumbled to dust. The reading rooms are empty ruins, if they exist at all. But the dream of a place where all human knowledge might be gathered, where any question might be answered, where the wisdom of all nations and all ages might be freely available, that dream endures. We are closer to realizing that dream now than ever before. The internet is a kind of global library, accessible from anywhere. Digital archives preserve texts that might otherwise be lost. Open access journals share research freely. Knowledge is more widely distributed than the Ptolemies could have imagined, yet challenges remain. Digital divides leave many without access. Misinformation spreads as quickly as truth. Important knowledge is locked behind paywalls. The work of preservation continues, as urgent now as it was in ancient Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria teaches us that knowledge is precious and fragile. It must be actively protected, or it will be lost. But it also teaches us that the impulse to learn, to understand, To share what we know, that impulse is among the best of human qualities. As you rest now, imagine yourself in Alexandria on a perfect day. The Mediterranean sun warms the white marble. You climb the steps to the library. The great doors open before you. Inside, scrolls beyond counting wait to share their wisdom. Scholars from distant lands gather to learn. The air hums with quiet concentration and the whisper of turning pages. You have come to a place where every question can be asked, where knowledge flows freely, where the accumulated wisdom of humanity is open to all. You have come to Alexandria, the library that burned but whose light still shines. Sleep well, dreamer. In the morning when you wake, you can visit your own library, physical or digital, and continue the ancient work. You can ask questions, seek answers, share what you learn. You can be a keeper of memory, a carrier of light. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its spirit lives in you, in all of us who value knowledge and the freedom to learn. Rest now. The stories have been told. The scrolls are safely stored. The scholars sleep peacefully in their quarters. Tomorrow, the work will continue. The library dreams of the future, and in those dreams, you are there. The end of tonight's journey. Sleep well, and may you dream of ancient wisdom and endless wonder.